メリカ中西部の町ラクーンシティ。作戦行動中の特殊な警察部隊スターズのメンバーはここである奇怪な体験をすることになる。銃弾が効かない獣の群れに襲われ逃げ込んだ巨大な館だが、その館がさらなる恐怖の入り口であることを彼らはまだ知らなかった。
You know, I always heard that Resident Evil started off life as a remake of the game Sweet Home. And if I'm not mistaken, is that the music from Sweet Home for the background? Huh. Alright, so one of the more underrated contributions that I feel the PlayStation made to the video game industry was the fact that it was really the first time where video games became more than just, something that was intended to entertain little kids. That was a perception that Nintendo just had to create for themselves in order to get the Nintendo Entertainment System into stores back in the day due to the video game crash of 1983. And though Sega tried to set themselves apart from Nintendo by encouraging developers to make games for an older audience, they kind of did so irresponsibly because they would market those games to kids instead of adults, which eventually led to trouble for the entire industry. After a government hearing, the ESRB was established, which became a unified ratings board for the video game industry. And Sony really embraced the ESRB because now that they had a very clear and concise rating system to use, they basically realized that they could make whatever games they wanted to. So they actually encouraged any developers, be it first, second, or third party, to make games with adults in mind. And one company that was willing to step up and do that was Capcom, and what they wanted to try was to actually make a video game that was scary, take an influence from the NES game Sweet Home. The project would eventually evolve into a game that would come to define what we know today as the survival horror genre. Though there were other horror video games before Resident Evil, Resident Evil is the franchise that put horror into the pop culture, and as a result, it's one of the single most influential games ever to be released on the original PlayStation. So in Resident Evil, you take the role of either Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, two members of a paramilitary police force known as STARS, Special Tactics and Rescue Squad. So they're sent out into the local mountains surrounding Raccoon City in order to investigate some disturbing occurrences over there, and things go wrong and they end up trapped in a mansion, which isn't much of an improvement on their situation because for whatever reason the place is crawling with zombies and a wide range of other freaky monsters. So now everyone has to find a way to get out of this mansion before they fall victim to the horrors that infest it. The plot of Resident Evil is really good. While it is a simple story when you get down to it, the way it's told is just expertly done. This is one of the games that really popularized environmental storytelling, where rather than the story revolving around the personal journey of our characters, it revolves more around the location that it takes place in and everything that went down there before you arrived. And Resident Evil still is one of the best examples of this I can think. There are still journal entries in this game that are liable to make the hair on the back of your neck stand out. It's just masterfully done, and it would come to influence the industry for years to come, as a lot of survival horror games that emulate Resident Evil still tell their story in that manner. That being said, the presentation in Resident Evil is awful. For starters, I'm not a huge fan of the graphics. Basically, what they did was they superimposed 3D character models over pre-rendered backgrounds, and I just don't think that it meshes all that well, and at times it can make it a little hard to see what you're doing. Some people would argue that that's the point. It heightens the horror or whatever, but that isn't why they chose to do that. This was a time of experimentation with 3D gaming. The reason they went with the fixed camera angles was because they wanted to use pre-rendered backgrounds, because you could get more detail out of that than going full 3D. So the cameras were fixed because they had to be, and because the cameras were fixed, that necessitated the infamous tank controls that the game is known for as well. So yeah, there are just a lot of reasons to really hate the graphics in this game. And the dialogue, dude. I often use the term Jill sandwich, which refers to any line of dialogue that is both poorly written and poorly delivered. And I got that phrase from this game because not only is the dialogue in this game horrendous, the voice acting is amazingly bad, dude. And, like, you could tell like it was just developers doing the voices of all these characters because the delivery is just laughably bad. And in a game that's trying to scare you, that is just poison, dude. Like, Resident Evil, it could still get under your skin, make no mistake, but whenever the characters talk, it just takes you right out of the experience. Like, I do not know what they were thinking. But what really makes Resident Evil work as a game is its gameplay. This is not a shooty bang bang type of game. While it is true that your primary defense against the horrors that await you in this game are dealt with through the use of guns and what have you, ammo and health items are really scarce in this game, so you have to ration your resources, try to avoid fights if you can, and just try to stockpile as much as you can, because if you just go plugging away at every enemy you see, there's a very good chance that you aren't going to make it to the end of the game. Every enemy encounter in this game is designed to kill you, so you really got to think about how you use your resources whenever you have to. Resident Evil is still a case study in how to do this, though there are some things that annoy me about it. While I'm tolerant of having a limited inventory space for your weapons, ammo, and health items, I really wish that the inventory items took up a separate inventory, because having to go back and forth to get the different inventory items can lead you to cover more ground than you otherwise would. There's also some things that they removed for the American release of Resident Evil, namely the auto-aim. You essentially have to aim your character at whatever you want to shoot at, and given the nature of the fixed camera angles, it's kind of hard to tell where your shot is going to go, which is really bad design in a game where you have to make every single shot count. They did this because rentals were a big concern at the time. People were afraid if the game was too easy, people would just finish the game and then they wouldn't buy it, not realizing that if people really loved the game, they would still buy it after they rented it. But yeah, there are a lot of issues with the original Resident Evil. Thankfully, there are other versions of this game, like the director's cut, which made some changes that do, change some things for the worse, but it does add the auto-aim, which makes it a lot better, and there are all kinds of different versions of Resident Evil, so you can still experience this game if you really want to, and if you're big into game design like me, this is basically required viewing. So Resident Evil would be an enormous success at retail, and it would immediately be followed by sequels, though Resident Evil has always had a history of really rocky development. For example, Resident Evil 2 was originally had one version that was made by, I think it was Hideki Kamiya, but Shinji Mikami, who was the director of the first game, didn't think it was up to snuff, so they canceled the game and started completely from scratch, and that was probably for the best because Resident Evil 2 ended up being one hell of a sequel, and is definitely the best of the original trilogy. It's one of the best games on the console. If you can only play one classic Resident Evil game, that's always the one I recommend. Resident Evil 2 would be followed by Resident Evil 3, which is actually not supposed to be the third Resident Evil game. The third Resident Evil game was actually supposed to be a game called Code Veronica for the Dreamcast, but as the production on the Dreamcast game got underway, Capcom entered into a weird exclusivity deal with Sony where the numbered games would stay on the PlayStation while the spin-offs would be released on other consoles. So they had to change the spin-off that they were making for the PlayStation to Resident Evil 3, and Resident Evil 3 on the Dreamcast became Code Veronica. It's a complete mess, and that probably explains why Resident Evil 3 probably isn't as good as Resident Evil 2. There was also Resident Evil Survivor on the PlayStation, which was this weird first-person shooter that was not very good at all. It was so bad that the Angry Video Game Nerd actually did a video on it, if that tells you anything about its quality. After the PlayStation bit the dust, though, you would think that the games would start coming out on PS2, but because they wanted to get an older audience on the GameCube, Nintendo entered into an exclusivity deal with Capcom where Resident Evil will be exclusive to the GameCube as opposed to the PlayStation. And some great games came out of this partnership. You, of course, had the awesome remake of the original Resident Evil, as well as the not terribly good, but still decent enough Resident Evil 0. But the big one that came out of this partnership was Resident Evil 4, which in itself is one of the most groundbreaking video games of all time. I can never decide which game I recommend to people who have never played Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 2, or Resident Evil 4. I tend to lean towards Resident Evil 4 since that's what I started with. But Resident Evil 4 unfortunately had a negative impact on the series because it led Capcom to take a more action-heavy focus with the series, which led to some less than stellar games with Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6. While I wouldn't call these games necessarily bad, I think they're actually a lot of fun. They just weren't what people wanted from a Resident Evil game. They weren't horror games like they were supposed to be. Thankfully, after some negative feedback from those games, Capcom would return to the horror with stellar results with Resident Evil 7, and they would continue it on with Resident Evil 8, which is still working in some action, but it's primarily a survival horror game, as it should be. Recently, though, the more popular Resident Evil games seem to be the remakes that Capcom is doing of the original PlayStation games. Resident Evil 2 Remake is still a fantastic game, and it's probably my favorite game of the franchise apart from Resident Evil 4. But now they're starting to make games that really don't need to be remade. Resident Evil 3, I don't think really need a remake. It probably could have just been DLC for Resident Evil 2 Remake. And I don't care what anyone says, the Resident Evil 4 Remake is garbage. Like, they just changed so much with the fundamentals of the gameplay that it just doesn't work as well as it's supposed to. And now I hear talk that they want to remake Resident Evil 5? Like, why? I don't know. But still, the original Resident Evil and most of the games on the PlayStation 1, they're great games. Highly recommend all of them. I probably would still recommend the remakes over the original PlayStation versions. But again, if you're big into game design like I am, you owe it to yourself to play these to really see how the genre and just game design has evolved since the days when we were trying and failing to figure out the third dimension. But that's going to do it for this one, guys. Be sure to join me tomorrow as we continue on with the PlayStation Retrospective.